In all your reading of the Bible, do you have a favorite parable? Well, my guess is what comes to mind first would be the prodigal son, or the good Samaritan, the rich fool, the lost sheep. Basically one of the parables we find in the New Testament that Jesus told, right? Well, in this episode of the Discover the Word podcast, Daniel Orion Day says that the New Testament isn't the only place that you find parables.
Did you know that there's quite a few parables in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament?
No, I did not know that.
Which is kind of cool.
Yeah. And so over the course of the next hour, Daniel invites Bill Crowder, Vivian Mabuni, and Rasul Berry, and the rest of us, to explore a few of those parables found in the Old Testament and discover what some Old Testament parables say about God and what they say about us. Pull your chair up to the table and be part of this conversation on Discover the Word. And welcome to Discover the Word and the start of another session of Bible engagement from Our Daily Bread Ministries. Discover the Word is a small group style Bible study in which we invite you to walk with us through topics and passages that inform the way we read the Scriptures, challenge us as we live our lives as followers of Christ, and always point us to discover Jesus in the pages of the Bible. And a key feature of this is that we do it in community, together. And we consider you part of this group and hope that your place around this table is a place where your faith can grow as well. And I think there's some things that will come out of this particular study that really will stand out to you as we go to some maybe unexpected parts of the story and wisdom of the Bible and find parables that provide a helpful perspective of God and a helpful perspective of ourselves. And it is Daniel who is leading the group through this look at Old Testament parables. And so he begins with a question about parables that the group answers in the predictable way you would expect.
When I say the word parables, what comes to mind?
Jesus.
Yeah, for me too.
That was his favorite teaching method.
Yeah.
Either he was telling parables or he was asking questions.
Mm-hmm.
That seemed to be his primary teaching methods.
Yeah, I think the kingdom of God is like.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So some phrasing that we see repeated quite a bit.
Yeah. And it seems to me that when he taught in parables, he was able to explain it to the disciples because they
didn't always understand the explanation, but he explained it.
Yeah, he did.
Did you know that there's quite a few parables in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament?
No, I did not know that.
Which is kind of cool.
Yeah. The only one I can think of is when Nathan confronts David over the Bathsheba situation, and he tells the story of the family that had the one little lamb that was like one of their kids.
But even in that one, we don't often think of it as a parable. We think about it as a story that Nathan kind of makes up on the fly to convict David.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about that
and
more.
with that overlay, though, then it really does transfer, like, in hearing that, it's like, oh, that is how Jesus taught. It's familiar.
Yeah.
And one other thing, too, that helps us in the New Testament is oftentimes there's a parabolic formula. The gospel writers will give us a hint. They'll say, and he spoke to them in parables and said, and then we get a series, okay, so those are parables because we were just told that's what they are.
Yeah, it's nice when we get that little nod that, hey, I'm getting ready to tell you a parable. So the first thing that we see in this is that Jesus is building off of an Old Testament or a Hebrew principle or style or however we want to say it.
Practice.
Jesus is doing something that isn't new. He's not inventing a new literary genre.
Yeah.
He's doing something that shows he's a part of the Jewish culture, and this is part of what it means to be Jewish. So that's one of the things I want us to think about as we're looking at these Old Testament parables. How does that then help us think about the New Testament and what Jesus is doing? But I don't want us to focus on Jesus so much that we miss the actual story that we're going to read in each of these parables, because I do want us to sit with each story that we see in the Old Testament. But first, what are parables in a Middle Eastern context?
Yeah, so when I think about parables, I kind of feel like it's not quite a fable,
right?
Not quite a metaphor, but it's somewhere in between, but it gets a little fuzzy.
Yep. In fact, one of the scholars that's been really influential for Discover the Word is Kenneth E. Bailey. And that's one of the things he points out is parables in a Middle Eastern context aren't fables. They're not like Aesop's fables, where there's a moral to the story, and the whole story is leading us to this idea. Don't give in to flattery, or you'll open your mouth to sing, and the pastry you want to eat will fall, and the fox will eat it, right? Like there's a story that's told.
Hate when that happens.
Right? And there's this moral of the story, don't give in to flattery.
Right.
There are morals that show up in parables, but if we're trying to just find one point that the parable's about, we're typically missing what's happening.
I think there's another extreme, too, that we sometimes go to. I mean, I understand what you're saying about if you try to just boil it down to one thing, we may miss some of the emphasis that's trying to be made. But I think there's also a danger in trying to make parables walk on all fours.
Absolutely,
And trying to make every little detail mean something
Right.
when it's just part of the story. That piece of it isn't necessarily there to teach some profound spiritual truth. It's just there to help tell the story.
Yeah, and that's the other side. They're not allegories.
Yeah,
Right,
that's
where
right.
it's like every name, I got to
Right.
figure out what this name means, and every place has some. Sometimes they do. Sometimes it's very pregnant with meaning, each of the different pieces. But to your point, not every detail has some magic meaning that we need to figure out in order to understand what the parable is. Does anybody know what the word parable means?
No.
I can tell you how I've always heard it defined, and then you can correct
for
me.
it.
I've always heard a parable defined as an earthly story with a heavenly meaning.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. The word parable has two words tied together, so the word para and balo. Para means alongside or together with, so a parable is para alongside with, and balo meaning to throw. So you're going to throw these two ideas next to each other, and by doing that, we see both of those ideas a little differently. And so it's very much a story. It's more than a literary device, like a metaphor or a simile. This is more of a storytelling method, to your point, Bill, of like an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. So the idea is that it's such an immersive story that it begins to shape how you see God, how you see one another, how you see the world, how you see the circumstances that you're in.
I think about such a popular parable when Jesus talks about the Good Samaritan and how it completely flips it on its head, because everyone expected the religious leaders to be the ones and to have the Samaritan of all people to be the one. It's masterful.
I think one of the things that with Jesus's parables, other than the fact that they were Jesus's parables, obviously, but one of the things that made them so immersive, to your point, Daniel, is that most of his parables were about things that were very commonplace. He lived in an agricultural world, and a lot of them were about agricultural ideas and fields and crops and different things. And so to immerse people in the story, he told them stories about things they were familiar with, but then took them to another place.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And one of the roles that parables play, definitely with Jesus, but we'll see this in the Old Testament as well, is they can do a lot of different things. They can challenge, they can remind people of different ideas. They are often pretty provocative because they have some kind of turn, like you're mentioning, Vivian, that Jesus makes that's surprising, and that surprise isn't something we like, right? It's kind of a provocative turn. They can confront, critique, disturb, sometimes all at the same time. They often comfort the disenfranchised or the down and out or those who are suffering. And they often confront the people in places of power or influence or wealth. So pretty much every time we run into a parable, it should surprise us. It should shake us up a bit. In fact, scholar Amy Jill Levine writes, if we hear a parable and think, I really like that, or worse, fail to take any challenge, we're not listening well enough. I thought that was really helpful. Parables challenge us to look into the hidden aspects of our own values and our own lives. So in other words, they expose blind spots in us. They bring to the surface unasked questions, and they reveal the answers we've maybe always known but refused to acknowledge. That's pretty powerful.
That is
excellent.
Yeah, they do a lot of work.
Yeah, that's right. And they're an intrinsic part of Jewish culture. So long before Jesus walked on the earth, parables were something that were being told, and we'll see that as we go through this series. Maybe a good way to summarize that is parable culture was a thing before Jesus showed up. And there was also a rhythm to parables. Bill, you mentioned that sometimes the New Testament will say, hey, this is a parable, and then it'll have like a rhythm to the beginning of it. And it's two different words that are kind of combined together. So emshal mashal, which is, I will tell you a parable, to what can a thing be compared? And then it goes on to do a comparison. And I think a great example of this is, could somebody read Mark 4, verse 30 for us.
Jesus also said, "With what can we compare the kingdom of God? Or what parable will we use for it? It is like a mustard seed, which, when sown upon the ground, is the smallest of all the seeds on earth. Yet, when it is sown, it grows up and becomes the greatest of all shrubs and puts forth large branches so that the birds of the air can make nests in its shade."
And that language of with what can we compare the kingdom of God is that parable language. So Jesus is building off of his Jewishness. He's telling a story just like other people in Jewish culture would tell. And that's like the ding, 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 a parable's coming. Now, of course, in this one, Jesus also then goes on to say, what parable can we use for it? So that's helpful too.
Yeah. For sure.
But that language of with what can we compare the kingdom of God is like, hey, a parable's coming. And just to illustrate how much a part of Jewish culture this was, there's a parable that a Jewish commentator writes into the Song of Songs as he's describing what this is about. And he describes parables saying, "Consider the king who has lost a gold coin or a precious pearl in his house. May he not find it by the light of a wick, worth no more than an isar or a penny." So the idea of this little tiny cheap thing, a wick, helping find something that's priceless. That doesn't remind you of any of Jesus' stories by chance, does it?
Well, a woman sweeping every corner of the house
That's
looking
right.
for a missing coin comes to mind.
Yeah. So even there, maybe Jesus in his story is pulling off of a story that existed in some way and is telling it for his purposes there. So that's what we're going to do this week. We're going to look in the Old Testament. We're going to look at some stories, some parables that show up. And I would encourage us to take the advice of that rabbi. What is this little story, and how does it help see God, help see ourselves, help us see the world, and even the context, and especially the context that the stories are in? How do we even see those differently through the little light of these parables?
Yeah, looking forward to spending this hour together exploring some of the Old Testament parables. And as Daniel said, seeing how they help us to see God, see ourselves, see the world, see the context in which these stories were told. All of that and more. Going to be a good study. And so in the next segment, we'll be focusing on a parable found in the book of Judges. It's a parable about leadership, the need for good leadership, and a caution about the kinds of leaders that we often choose. And it's a parable that provides an insight into leadership that was not only true in centuries past, but can be true in our day as well, true in leadership applications of many kinds. It's an Old Testament parable that we're going to call The Trees Need a King.
So I want to jump straight into an Old Testament or a Hebrew Bible parable. So this is in Judges, and I've handed out assignments to read it. Judges chapter 9, verses 8 through 15. So we're going to read it. Hopefully it'll help it come to life a little bit. So here we go. "The trees once went out to anoint a king over themselves. So they said to the olive tree, 'Reign over us.'
The olive tree answered them, 'Shall I stop producing my rich oil by which gods and mortals are honored and go sway over the trees?'
Then the trees said to the fig tree, 'You come and reign over us.'
But the fig tree answered them, 'Shall I stop producing my sweetness and my delicious fruit and go to sway over the trees?'
Then the trees said to the vine, 'You come and reign over us.'
But the vine said to them, Shall I stop producing my wine that cheers gods and mortals and go to sway over the trees?'
So all the trees said to the bramble, 'You come and reign over us.'
And the bramble said to the trees, 'If in good faith you are anointing me king over you, then come and take refuge in my shade. But if not, let fire come down out of the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon.'"
Yeah, so we're reading the Bible right now. Not a story we read very often, huh?
No. It
Yeah.
sounds like a children's book a little bit too, you know?
Yep. So this is a parable in the Old Testament, and I think it'd be good for us to maybe think about what the context is so we can hopefully understand what's going on in this story. So the story actually starts with Gideon. So we got to rewind a little bit. Judges 8, verses 22 through 23. Well, Russell will read that for us.
Yep. Then the Israelites said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also, for you have delivered us out of the hand of Midian." Gideon said to them, "I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you.
Yeah. So hear a lot of rule language, right? So we heard that in the parable. Will you rule over us? Will you rule over us? So here in Judges 8, Israel comes to Gideon and asks him to rule. Now, Bill, give us a little context about who Gideon is. Why would they even think to come to Gideon to rule over them?
He was one of the judges. There's this period of time after Joshua had passed and before Samuel came on the scene where they had this series of judges who were kind of the representative of God's leadership for the nation. The nation was supposed to be a theocracy, a monarchy where God is king. But he administered that rule through these judges. And Gideon, of course, is best known for getting together a rather small army and using some trumpets and jars and torches to rout the enemy and win a great victory. But he had some faith challenges along the way.
Yeah, he did. And so the people want to be like the other nations. They all have kings. So maybe Gideon will be our king and rule over us. And Gideon says what?
No.
No. And in fact, not only no, but who should rule over them?
God.
Yeah. So we have this moment of faithfulness, you could say, from Gideon. Unfortunately, it's short-lived, but it is a moment of faithfulness for Gideon. But then the story starts to unfold. You find out Gideon had many sons because he had many wives, which is something that was warned about early on in the Hebrew Bible. Gideon also had a nickname, so it gets kind of confusing trying to follow his story because sometimes he's called Gideon and sometimes he's called Jerubbaal or Baal. And that name actually means to establish Baal as king or god, which is ironic because he actually did the opposite, which was de-establish Baal. So it was like a nickname.
Like calling the big guy tiny.
Right.
Right. There you go.
Yep.
Tiny.
But then Gideon did what so many other people do. So at first he's tearing down the high places, he's leading the people, he's showing faithfulness to God, but he falls away at the end of his life and actually leads Israel away from faithfulness to Yahweh, to God. And his son Abimelech ends up being even worse. Basically, you can summarize Abimelech's story as, remember how my dad Gideon said he didn't want to be king? I'll be king and rule over you. In fact, the name Abimelech means my father is king. Now, was his father king?
No.
No. So I don't know how he got this name. I don't know if he claimed it for himself or not. But he offers himself to be king over the competition of his 70 brothers, and he hires quote-unquote worthless and reckless fellows to help him. Look that up in the Bible. You actually see similar language with David's first group of followers and Jephthah's followers as well. And then what does Abimelech do? He decides to kill all of his brothers, all of his competition, and he does that on one stone, the story says. So he comes and he kills all of his brothers on one stone. Just imagine that for a second.
Yeah, this is not exactly a happy story, is it?
No.
There's one brother that escapes. His name's Jotham. Jotham means God acts with integrity.
Wow.
So even the names in this story are really important. Abimelech, my father was king, but really wasn't king, but he's trying to act like he should be king because of Gideon.
Right.
And then Jotham, the brother that escapes, is God acts with integrity. That's pretty crazy. All right, so now Jotham is the one who escapes, and Jotham's the one that tells this parable. Okay, so now how does that potentially change or help us as we think about what Jotham is saying with this story?
Yeah, it gives a lot of context because you're talking about someone who he's barely escaped with his life. 68 of his siblings have been murdered by another one. It's just a lot of bloodshed, a lot of ambition of, Abimelech to want to be king. It just feels like this concept of rule. And even it feels like a kind of foreshadowing of what Samuel, too, when he pleaded with the people not to establish a king over them like they wanted with Saul. So it seems like there's something deep going on about what it means to rule and the quality of the person who tends to step up and says, I want that job that Jotham is getting at.
Yeah. Now, who of the trees, so the trees are trying to find someone to rule over them, and they go to these first groups, so the olive, the fig, the vine. And why don't those trees, olive, fig, and vine, why do they say no?
They talk about, should I leave the thing that has brought me wealth and notoriety, favor? So should I leave my sweetness, says the fig, or my abundance, says the olive?
Yep. And what would they be leaving if they stopped doing that?
Their purpose.
Their purpose.
Yeah, their purpose.
Yep. So the three things that have something to offer the world are being asked to stop doing the thing that they have to offer, or maybe do it in a different way. And they say, no, because this is what my purpose is. This is what I should do. So what's the one plant that has nothing to offer?
The bramble.
The bramble. And who's the one that volunteers to be king?
The bramble.
And it's ironic that the bramble, which is just, just a low bush, says, okay, come and rest in my shade.
Yeah.
Right. Would that be comfortable? If you could get under there, would that?
Yeah, it wouldn't be an
comfortable.
enjoyable experience, would it?
Yeah. And then what does the bramble say will happen if you backstab me, or if you make me king and you don't mean it?
Call down fire.
Yeah.
Which brambles are highly flammable. I think about wildfires, and this is just dry
tumbleweed,
right? That thing catches fire,
And the contrast then with the cedars of Lebanon.
Right.
I mean, that's
beautiful, majestic.
It's like the redwoods of that part of the world.
Yeah, and what do the cedars of Lebanon often represent in the story of the Bible?
Stability,
power, strength. They were used to make ships because they could be trusted. Their wood was strong.
Yes.
You mentioned wealth.
Yep.
How were they used?
I think about Solomon in the temple.
Right.
He got cedars from Lebanon and got those shipped in to build the temple.
Yep. So it shows power, influence. It shows it'll be used to build, the throne room or the temple or whatever. So what burns those down?
A bramble.
The little bramble. So what do you think Jotham's trying to communicate? What are some of the ideas that he's communicating as he's standing on Mount Gerizim, which is where the Samaritan temple will be later? He's standing there and he's telling this story. Who's he critiquing, first of all?
Abimelech, first of all, but also the people.
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost a be careful what you ask for
Yes.
kind of situation.
Yeah, because it says, verse 8, the trees once went out to anoint a king over them. And they said to the trees, reign over us. So they are recruiting.
Yeah.
Right.
They're out looking. And I think he's making this call and this statement that you're setting yourself up for failure and for someone that's actually going to destroy. And I guess there's something maybe in this parable that's pointing to like the ones that recognize their purpose, as you were saying, Bill, are not going to leave their posts. But the one person who will leave their post is someone that doesn't have a whole lot of integrity and something to value. And so, and that's exactly the person who's going to burn the whole thing down, which in the book of Judges is what happens.
Yeah.
Right.
And so Jotham's saying that about Abimelech by doing what? Telling a parable, right? Right? So instead of coming straight out and saying everything you just said, Rasul, to Abimelech, it's, I'm going to tell a story. And by the end of this story, you're going to see what I'm trying to say.
Right.
Which is one of the primary roles that parables do, is they often pull you into a story, and by the end, you begin to see things differently. So what are some of the things, as we think about not just that context, but even our own context, what are some of the things that we see differently as a result of being in this story?
I think it challenges us to carefully examine the kind of person we would want to have as a leader. Or the kind of person we would need to be if we were going to be the right kind of leader. I think a lot of, as you were just saying, Daniel, a lot of it is not just how we view someone else, but how do we view ourselves. And it calls for some self-examination as well.
Yeah, beware of who in particular.
Yeah.
Anyone who is like, I'll do it.
Right.
I want this post.
Right.
I want to be king.
Right.
Which, if we just think about politically where we are and so many other aspects of our lives, we have a lot of people that are quick to volunteer, like, oh, I'll be the one that leads or whatever. And those are the exact people the parable is warning us to be careful of. And to Bill's point, sometimes we're that person. I want the power.
Yeah.
I want the influence.
Exactly.
And that's when we're acting like the bramble as well.
That's excellent. I think that, you hear the term drunk with power, but I think power is intoxicating. And even if it's not on a national scale, even whatever little that we are entrusted with, it can get to our heads. And so I think this is a great warning for us to be evaluating.
Yeah. And it reminds me of what we talked about in our first conversation. Parables often comfort the disenfranchised or the down and out, and confront people in places of power, influence, and wealth. And this parable was definitely meant to confront the person that said, not only will I be king, but I'm going to remove any competition and kill anybody in my way.
Memorable parable about leadership from the book of Judges. The trees need a king. An ancient story that spoke volumes in that time and also in a lot of ways speaks across the centuries, doesn't it? Great place to start, looking at some Old Testament parables here on Discover the Word. Well, for the next parable, we'll be fast-forwarding to the point in Israel's history when their greatest king, their greatest leader, David, was on the throne. So many reasons to think of him as a man after God's own heart. But there were a couple of times when people came to him and told him a parable that did not shine a positive light on him at all. And in both cases, I don't think David saw it coming. We'll look at possibly the most familiar Old Testament parable when this edition of Discover the Word continues after a quick timeout for this reminder. Just a quick time out from this study to remind you that this is the last week that you'll be able to participate in our online survey about how Discover the Word is helping you to grow spiritually. And we want to know what's important to you as we prepare for future episodes. We'd like to know what you like and maybe what you don't like as much about the way we study together. Going forward, it's our hope that we can continue helping you deepen your relationship with God and because of that, love those around you better. This survey will help us evaluate how we're doing and find ways to make improvements as we plan for those future episodes. So again, time's running out for you to access our survey at discovertheword.org and let your voice be heard. Just go to discovertheword.org and click on the survey banner that's up at the top of the page. And then to express our gratitude, once you complete the survey, you'll be able to pick one complimentary book from either Bill Crowder or Elisa Morgan. But again, this is the last week that we'll be collecting this data. And so if you haven't done so yet, make sure you access our survey at discovertheword.org. There's a survey banner at the top of the page that you can click on and it will take you there. And now back to another Old Testament parable.
This parable is probably the one that if someone thought about what we were talking about, this is probably the story that came to mind of, I remember that story in the Old Testament. That sounded parabolic. And if that was you, good job, because it is. It's a parable. So let's read it. I need you to start halfway through the verse because I want to just read the parable and not any of the stuff leading up to the parable. So 2 Samuel 12, verses 1 through 4.
There were two men in a certain town. One was rich and one was poor. The rich man owned a great many sheep and cattle. The poor man owned nothing but one little lamb he had bought. He raised that little lamb, and it grew up with his children. It ate from the man's own plate and drank from his cup. He cuddled it in his arms like a baby daughter. One day, a guest arrived at the home of the rich man. But instead of killing an animal from his own flock or herd, he took the poor man's lamb and killed it and prepared it for his guests.
How do you feel after reading that story?
It kind of makes you a little angry.
Yeah, absolutely.
The picture of the lamb eating out of the man's hand and drinking out of his cup, it just kind of reminds me of how certain people have this type of deep, loving relationship with their pets. I don't have a pet, but those who do. And this becomes like a part of the family, like I said, one of his children. And to see that kind of setup to, you know what? I don't want to use any of my animals, so I'll just go and take that one.
And the contrast, because the rich man had no relationship with his many sheep and his many cattle. Right. And then to have that contrast with the poor man only had the one little lamb who was part of the family. It breaks my heart. This is a brilliant story because we're just sucked right in. Yeah. And I think it's actually brilliant when we think about the context of who the story was being told to.
This parable alone just shows how interesting and captivating stories in the Bible can be, how jarring they can be.
And subversive.
How subversive they can be. So now let's look at the context. Where are we in the story of Israel?
David's king, and he's been king for a while, but he's been king long enough that there's some good things going on, but he has some lapses in his duty, if we could put it that way. I think it's the previous chapter that opens with, at the time of the year when kings went to war,
Yep.
David sent somebody else to go to war on his behalf. Part of his job was to lead the armies. He didn't go and lead the armies. He sent someone else in his place. And that's what started the whole ball rolling of all the stuff that happens after that.
Yeah. And it's the first indication we have that this super positive story that's happening with King David and the way everything's changing for the good. And I mean, Jerusalem is the capital now because David made Jerusalem the capital. He brings the ark into the city and dances before it. He's a worshiper. He's leading the people. He goes before the ark.
And I think it's really good that you point all that out, Daniel, because there may be no more overly idealized character in the Bible than David.
Yeah.
For all of those reasons.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that every time you think about David or talk about him, you need to say, yeah, but don't forget the whole Bathsheba thing, you know what I mean? But we do tend to overly idealize him. That makes it even more of a shock when he acts like a broken human being.
And part of that over-idealization, Rasul, could you read 2 Samuel 8, verse 15?
So David reigned over all Israel, and David administered justice and equity to all his people.
Ooh, that feels good.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Now, to Bill's point, all the kings go off to war.
He does.
I'm going to stay here. What happens?
I also see a progression in 2 Samuel 11 because it says, 1, he doesn't go off to war. Verse 2, it happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch. So it's the sense of leisure that's happening there, right? So even in the context of him sticking around, he's kind of just lounging. Then he sees a woman bathing. He sees that she's very beautiful. He then inquires about this woman that he sees. And it's just like you just see this descent into sin that leads him to take Bathsheba, sleep with her, send her husband off to war after realizing she gets pregnant. But then Uriah shows more restraint and self-control because as a leader in the army, he doesn't want to be with his wife when the rest of his soldiers can't. And so with their wives. And so he doesn't do it. So now it's going to expose the pregnancy is not his. And so then he puts Uriah in the front line, tells the leader of the army to move back so that he can be killed. And all of this cover up is happening. And meanwhile, he thinks nobody knows. And then enter Nathan in chapter 12.
Yeah, it's interesting as you were describing all that, Rasul. I was reminded of the fact that, as you said, he inquires about the woman.
Right.
But he doesn't pay any attention to the answer. Because the answer is this not the wife of Uriah the Hittite? Uriah the Hittite was one of David's mighty men. He was one of his inner circle of trusted bodyguards and troops and stuff. And even once he's given that information, which should be enough to say, oh, man, I mean, you know, it'd be wrong to do this with anybody, but I don't want to mess around with the wife of one of my guys.
Totally.
You know?
Yeah.
And it's important, too, to recognize the power dynamic that's at play here, right? Like, this isn't Bathsheba coming in and not feeling any pressure and deciding to do something herself. This is rape, institutional rape, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, this story is horrible on every level. And then she goes into mourning when Uriah is killed. And then when the time of mourning is over, David marries her. He expects at that point that's the end of the story. But then if somebody could read 2 Samuel 12, verse 1.
And the Lord sent Nathan to David. He came to him and said to him.
And then tells the parable. How does David respond to the parable?
Like we did.
Yeah, right?
Yeah, verse 5, then David's anger was greatly kindled against the man. And he said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. He shall restore the lamb fourfold, hearkening back to the Old Testament law of restitution, because he did this thing and because he has had no pity. So David goes in. He's like, justice for the man whose lamb was taken.
David's indicting David.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
That's the power of parables.
Yes.
Is by telling this story. Now, of course, Nathan then looks at him and says, you are that man. And David's response is, oh, I am.
Yeah.
But at this point in the story, the response that David comes out with is to proclaim himself guilty, to pronounce himself guilty, to be the judge and jury and say, whoever did that
should die.
Right. And as a result, David's condemning himself.
Mm-hmm.
So a powerful story like this, it invites you in, it shapes how you see things, so much so that the person in power was not only confronted, but actually indicted themselves.
Yeah.
Now, in reality, like, think back to that story. Could that lamb actually be restored fourfold?
No.
No, because what was lost?
The actual relationship with that particular lamb.
Yeah. How did this parable start? There were two men. One was rich and one was poor.
Mm.
Jesus has a parable. Luke 16, verses 19 through 20. Could somebody read that? How does that begin?
There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores.
A rich man and a poor man. And I wonder if when Jesus tells that parable later, that's a nod back to Nathan and Nathan's parable of a rich man and a poor man. The stories end up being somewhat similar in some ways. Different context, different intention, I think, with what Jesus is doing. But even that potentially could be the model. Remember how we talked about how Jesus is following this parabolic model of, hey, what can the kingdom of God be compared to? Well, even in Jesus's parables, I wonder if some of those are nods back to some of these other stories. There's a rich man and a poor man. Ooh, I know where this story is going because I know another story about a rich man and a poor man from the Old Testament. So parables show our blind spots. They reveal sin. They cause us to sometimes realize in our own selves what we've done wrong. And I think this parable forces us to ask some questions about our own lives too, right? What are some of the questions that this might force us to ask?
I think the most in-my-face question that it asks me is, in what area of life am I so selfish that I'm willing to take whatever I want, no matter what it might cost someone else?
Yeah. Perhaps too, where do I look in other people's lives and desire what they have? Right?
I think about the blind spot. In what ways am I living in a way that if someone gave me a parable, I would be like, that guy got to go. Like that, there's judgment, but it's a blind spot in my own life. And someone would say, you are that man.
Yeah.
There's such a humility, and I think our tendency towards discontentment and coveting, which is one of the 10 Commandments. God knew, like, we are prone to covet. That's something that we need a heart check on, because just chapters earlier, we see David trusting God, inquiring of him, leading the armies, doing bold, faith-filled things, and none of us are exempt from falling into sin.
If he hadn't told that story in the way that he did, I don't know if we'd have the same conclusion that we have. And so that shows the beauty and the power of parables.
Yeah, that's one of the powers of parables, to draw out that, that's me, recognition. Stories like this can kind of sneak in under our radar, but then we see ourselves. We catch a vision of God, and we see others in a different light. The power of a parable, like this one the prophet Nathan told to David. Great example, maybe the most familiar example of an Old Testament parable. Well, next, let's look at another parable told to David that confronts him about another serious failure on his part. Such a realistic story that when you just read the parable, you wonder, is it a parable or is it real life? But when you realize who's telling the story and the rest of the context around it, well, you understand that this is another brilliant parable that cuts deeply into a blind spot in David's life and just may hold a mirror up to our lives as well. So the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, balancing those two principles, taking both into consideration, is what makes knowing how to dispense justice so complicated and so challenging, because both the letter of the law and the spirit of the law are important, and whether one is more important than the other depends a lot on the context. So buckle up for another intriguing part of this conversation based on another Old Testament parable.
I'm just going to turn a couple pages in your Bible, depending on how far apart 2 Samuel 12 is and 2 Samuel 14. And if someone could read 2 Samuel 14, verses 5 through 7, just start with alas.
Alas, I am a widow, and my husband is dead. Your servant had 2 sons, and they fought with one another in the field. There was no one to part them, and one struck the other and killed him. Now the whole family has risen against your servant. They say, give up the man who struck his brother, so that we may kill him for the life of his brother whom he murdered, even if we destroy the heir as well. Thus they would quench my one remaining ember, and leave to my husband neither name nor remnant on the face of the earth.
First of all, does this feel like a parable?
No.
No, it feels like what?
Like it really happened.
Like a true story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And as we'll see as we unpack this, there's a woman who comes before the king, shares a story of something that she's experienced. And that's very typical for, as we talked about in our last conversation, one of the roles of a king is to administer justice and equity. And so sometimes would act as judge, and people would come and share the case that they're experiencing. And so at first, we think reading this that, oh, this is a true story. But as we'll see, the way it gets set up is that this is actually not a true story. It's a parable that's being used to talk about something else. So let's do that. So first of all, really unfortunate, tragic, horrible story in chapter 13. What happens?
Amnon, one of David's sons, rapes Tamar, who is his half-sister.
Yeah.
And she is the full sister of Absalom, and Absalom ends up avenging that act by having Amnon killed. And that puts him at odds with David,
Yeah.
which sets a whole nother series of unfortunate events in motion.
And after Amnon rapes Tamar, what does David do about that? Let's read 2 Samuel 13, verse 21. Maybe Vivian, you could read that for us.
When King David heard of all these things, he became very angry, but would not punish his son Amnon because he loved him, for he was his firstborn.
That last phrase in particular should really jump out. Firstborn. In a patriarchal culture, it's all about the firstborn. That firstborn, in some good ways, would be responsible for caring for all the people. But in this story, what does the firstborn do?
He rapes his sister. The other thing that is ironic, tragically ironic about David's refusal to execute judgment and justice as a king, because he was his firstborn, he knows from his own story that God chose him and upended primogeniture, right, in his own choosing as king, when his father didn't even think he would be one of the ones that would be considered. He was the one that God chose, even though he was small and in stature and all that.
Young.
So it's particularly ironic that he would have such a preference, even though he knew that God doesn't look on the outside, but looks in the heart. And that was part of his own story.
With firstborn rank came firstborn privilege. And in a sense, what Amnon does is he follows his dad's example of exercising his privilege to take what he wants,
Right.
even though what he wants is not available to him. He takes it anyway.
Yeah. And so someone else decides to administer their version of justice. And who is that, and what does he do?
Absalom has him
the
killed.
brother
Yeah.
of...
How does he have him killed? Do you remember?
He plots that thing
Yeah.
and waits for 3 years so that everybody thinks it's blown over. Everybody's forgotten, and he invites them to a feast, and there he's ambushed, and he kills him.
Yeah, so he plans a feast, has all of David's sons invited over, and kills Amnon. And at first, David actually hears that all of his sons were killed,
Right.
but finds out that actually it was just Amnon. And then Absalom flees, and you reference 3 years. He's gone for 3 years. And over that time, David eventually gets over the grief of seeing Amnon killed and begins to miss Absalom and wants to be reconciled to him. And so Joab, who's who?
He's the guy that David sent into battle at the head of the army when he didn't want to go.
Yep, he's kind of the right-hand military
General.
leader,
Yeah.
general guy for David. He realizes the king is missing Absalom, so he recruits a wise woman to help him. And so if someone could read 2 Samuel 14, 2-3, that's where we see this.
He said to her, "Pretend to be a mourner. Put on mourning garments. Do not anoint yourself with oil, but behave like a woman who has been mourning many days of the dead. Go to the king and speak to him as follows." And Joab put the words into her mouth.
So that story we read,
Which sounded like a true story, actually is a parable.
yeah, and so let's just reread it. Vivian, could you reread the parable for us?
Sure. Alas, I am a widow. my husband is dead. Your servant had 2 sons, and they fought with one another in the field. There was no one to part them. And one struck the other and killed him.
Pause. What other story does that sound a lot like?
Cain and Abel.
Cain and Abel,
Mm-hmm.
right? So already this parable might be pulling on more threads than just Amnon and Absalom,
Mm-hmm.
but this is going all the way back to the first murder that we see in the whole story of the Bible, which is a brother versus a brother.
Mm.
So keep reading.
Yes. Now the whole family has risen against your servant. They say, give up the man who struck his brother, so that we may kill him for the life of his brother, whom he murdered, even if we destroy the heir as well. Thus they would quench my one remaining ember, and leave to my husband neither name nor remnant on the face of the earth.
So what are some of the problems, what are the questions that this woman is raising that makes this a complicated case?
One of the principles in the Old Testament that we hear frequently referenced is an eye for an eye.
Yeah.
What she's saying is it's not as simple as that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There's more at stake here than just a life for a life. There's a lineage, there's a legacy, there's a heritage.
Who's going to take care of her
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
if both of her sons are killed? So we have a question about capital punishment show up here. Like, oh man, this is hard, right? I thought it was going to be easy. You did this, so you get this.
Right.
But in this case, that actually causes pain for other people who weren't involved in the story as well. So now what do we do, right? It raises that question to the top. So David hears this story and he responds. If someone could read 2 Samuel 14 verses 10 through 13, this is how David the king responds.
The king, David, said, if anyone says anything to you, bring him to me, and he shall never touch you again. Then she said, please, may the king keep the Lord your God in mind, so that the avenger of blood may kill no more, and my son not be destroyed. He said, as the Lord lives, not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground. Then the woman said, please, let your servant speak a word to my lord the king. He said, speak. The woman said, why then have you planned such a thing against the people of God? For in giving this decision, the king convicts himself, inasmuch as the king does not bring his banished one home again.
Ooh.
What about speaking truth to power?
Yeah. And that's one of the things parables do,
Yeah.
is by telling these stories,
Yeah.
it confronts those who are in power. And this is the second time David's heard a parable.
He's like, they got me again.
And the end result is you are that man, right? So you are that man, and
Yeah.
giving this decision, the king convicts himself. What else jumps out to you about this?
One of the things that she says is that in the midst of his decision-making process, David has ignored remembering the Lord's role in all of this. That it's almost as if she's saying, you've taken that place and put yourself in the place of God in this situation, but you need to remember the Lord your God.
Oh, yeah. Please may the king keep the Lord your God in mind, so that the answer he gives is in line with what God would want.
Yeah.
I think one of the things this parable does too is it asks us to consider, what would we do
Right.
in this situation? And one of the things parables are really good at is inviting us at different times to be different characters in the parable. So for some of us, like, I'm sure there's listeners who have situations in their families right now where there's two people that are really at odds with each other. They really feel the pain of this woman. Maybe murder hasn't happened yet, but they feel the pain of this woman. Or maybe they're the king who knows of this story, trying to figure out what to do. And it's like, this feels hard.
Yeah.
This feels complicated. And that's exactly what this woman's doing.
Yeah, and I think it's probably important as I'm looking at it to reflect on the fact that this isn't just like a Law and Order legal saga debate that is going up to the Supreme Court, right? Like, David in his own life has done more to people for less, and God has spared him. You know, I think about, Abigail and Nabal, and when he's like, was offended by somebody. And so when you talk about defending character, that was something he was about. But to have his son have to just live with the shame and the pain of seeing his sister had experienced that assault, but not do anything about it. And then when he does do something about it, you make it like that's the worst thing in this story, not your own inaction. Yeah. So it gets to, why have you then planned such a thing against the people of God? It's like your own personal emotional state, like his inactivity, his lack of involvement and engagement is the bigger problem. Don't make that problem worse because in how harshly you're dealing with somebody who did something when you were doing nothing.
Yeah. And kind of going back to what you were saying, Daniel, I think when we're talking about our life and how we read this parable, it's bigger than us. And so even this woman is bringing in the fact that her future is being affected negatively by this rift. And I think of the examples that you were just saying, like the immediate family, if there's family members that are at odds with each other, or division in the church, that it just affects more than just the people that were involved.
Yeah. And one of the things that struck me as you were describing the situation, Rasul, a minute ago, is that both of these last two parables we've looked at have been parables directed at David. Because of situations that resulted from something he did not do. The first one, he did not go to war to lead the armies, and it triggered all these other things. The second one, he did not deal with Amnon, not just as a king, but even as a father. He didn't deal with him as a father, and his inaction triggered what followed.
And I think a parable like this can also invite us to think about other quote-unquote laws that aren't as simple as we want them to be. Like, is it wrong to steal? Yeah. Is it wrong for a parent to steal if the only way they could get food for their starving child is to take the food? Maybe it's still wrong to steal. Maybe we get to that conclusion, but all of a sudden that situation makes us look at that law differently, right? And I think that's what's happening here as well, is what should happen versus what should happen.
That's
right?
good. Yeah.
And so one of the things that parables do beautifully is just create nuance and cause us to deal with problems in maybe a few different ways than we would otherwise. And just a little nod to the New Testament. Does Jesus tell any parables about two brothers?
The prodigal son.
Yeah. And so again, it might not be direct. It's not like he's saying, here's the new version of that story in the past. But I think it shows that when Jesus is telling his parables, there's this lineage, this history that Jesus is building off of, even with his. And what a cool thing to see that as a part of who Jesus is too.
Yeah, the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. That's what parables so often provide insight and nuance into. We see it in Jesus' parables, and we see it in Old Testament parables as well, like this one from the life of David, where David is confronted with his part in the tragic Amnon, Tamar, Absalom situation. Daniel Ryan Day, Bill Crowder, Vivian Mabuni, and Rasul Berry are looking at several Old Testament parables together this week, and we have one more that we'll explore in just a moment, one that the prophet Isaiah told to the nation of Israel about consequences. It's about a vineyard and the kind of grapes that you would expect to get with all the cultivating work that's done in the vineyard. And then the kinds of grapes that are actually being produced. It's a sobering message for Israel and a sobering principle for us to understand as well. But first, let's take a moment to peek ahead to what the group will be talking about in our next podcast. Next week, this same group was going to assemble around the table, but this time Vivian will be leading the group in some conversations about marriage. So how does the world around us view marriage today? How do Christians think about marriage? Well, Vivian and her husband Darren speak at marriage conferences, and so I think we'll find it helpful to go over some things related to marriage coming from a Christian worldview.
Well, my husband and I went to the store and we purchased a 10 puzzle box. So all of the puzzles were in individual bags. There were 10 puzzles. And instead of one box top, each puzzle bag had the picture, and then we lost one of the pictures. We could spend all that time finding the edges and maybe guessing that this could be sky or water, but it would be challenging, I think, to try to do a puzzle without the box top. And so when we talk about this topic of marriage, let's look at the box top. Like, let's look at the overarching plan that God had for marriage from the scriptures.
Yeah, don't miss our next study about marriage here on Discover the Word. And now, for the conclusion of our discussion about Old Testament parables, we turn to the writings of the prophet Isaiah, who lived at a time when injustice, in many forms, was rampant in Israel, and they were not living out their part of the covenant that God had made with them. And so, to deliver a message from God, Isaiah tells a parable. Let's explore it together.
We're in Isaiah chapter 5. Let's read just the parable part of verses 1 through 2. Vivian, you want to read that for us?
Sure. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it and cleared it of stones and planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower in the midst of it and hewed out a wine vat in it. He expected it to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes.
Interesting story. Where's the surprise in the story?
It yielded wild grapes, which I think we need to probably explain.
Right.
That means like bitter, not domestic sweet grapes. It just was not at all what you would expect in a cultivated situation.
Yeah, so, and one of the things about parables, and Jesus was a master at this, is he would tell a story that people were pretty familiar with the rhythm of the story. And then all of a sudden he'd just change a detail at the end. And that would be the piece that was like, wait, what?
Yeah.
A Samaritan?
Right.
The Good Samaritan? I thought it was going to be the lay leader, right?
Yes.
Because if you're going to mention a priest and a Levite, then you would mention the lay leader in the church, but a Good Samaritan? Really? Right? So when Jesus tells these parables, he has this little pivot at the end, and that's exactly what we see here in the Old Testament. He expected it to yield grapes. Why would he expect that?
Because of all the work.
Because he planted vineyards. You plant a vineyard, you expect to get grapes, right?
Yeah, but it yielded wild grapes instead. So what's the context? Where are we in the story of Israel, especially at the beginning of Isaiah?
Well, Assyria is the big enemy of the northern kingdom.
Yep.
But this is also, chapter 5 lands, not surprisingly, just before chapter 6. And chapter 6 is famous because of the phrase, in the year that King Uzziah died.
Yep.
His death ended what scholars say is maybe the greatest season of prosperity in Israel aside from the reign of Solomon. Safety, security, prosperity, all was well. And in this season of great well-being during Uzziah's reign, you get this story about things don't always work out.
Yeah. And the pivot, right? The fact that they would expect sweet, amazing grapes because everything, quote unquote, is going well.
Right.
But is everything actually going well? That's exactly what Isaiah's pulling on here. So you have Assyria growing in power. We're going to find out later in Isaiah there's another powerhouse that's also coming, which is Babylon. And by growing in power, Assyria is putting a lot of pressure on all the surrounding kingdoms. And there's pretty much two options. What are the two options?
Align with them or be destroyed.
Or be destroyed. Those are the two options. A part of be destroyed is a little more complicated because you could try to go to Egypt and have Egypt come help. Hey, we'll work with you guys. You come protect us. We'll send money to you instead, which some of the nations would do. They'd make alliances with some of the other kingdoms. Or they'd become a vassal of Assyria, meaning that they would send tribute or they would recognize Assyria as the power. And so that's part of what's going on here. And one of the major themes in Isaiah, one of the questions that's kind of rising is, should we fight Assyria ourselves? And in essence, Isaiah is saying, should we trust God with this or should we make an alliance with someone else? That's one of the questions that comes up.
And early in Deuteronomy, when Moses was talking about there's going to come a time when you're going to have a king. There were some warnings given to the king. You're not to multiply wives.
Right.
Thanks, Solomon. You're not to multiply horses. Again, thanks, Solomon. He had entire cities built to take care of his horses and his chariots. But the third was, don't make an alliance with Egypt. You were rescued from Egypt. Don't go back into that again. And I think the implication is God is greater than Egypt. And he's already proven that to you. So don't resubmit yourself to them. Keep your trust in God.
Yep. So that's one of the themes that kind of unpacks throughout Isaiah. But there's another theme, and this is really where this parable comes in. Another major theme in Isaiah is dealing with the wealthier getting wealthier and wealthier and wealthier on the backs of the poor who are getting poor, more poor and more poor and more poor. There's rampant injustice, and it's not just Isaiah, but we saw a lot of the quote-unquote minor prophets also calling out injustice on the backs of the poor, and specifically calling out those who accumulate wealth, hold it over others, and they're suffering as a result of the wealthy getting wealthier.
Yeah.
So now let's read this parable again, but instead of just the parable, let's read from verse 1 all the way through verse 7. And this is one of the few times that we get not just a parable, but an explanation. And the explanation gets more and more clear as we go. So maybe, Vivian, you could read verses 1 through 2, Rasul 3 and 4, and then Bill, you could close it out.
Let me sing for my beloved my love song concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it and cleared it of stones and planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower in the midst of it and hewed out a wine vat in it. He expected it to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes.
And now, inhabitants of Jerusalem and people of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? When I expected it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes?
And now I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it shall be devoured. I will break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. I will make it a waste. It shall not be pruned or hoed, and it shall be overgrown with briars and thorns. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the people of Judah are his pleasant planting. He expected justice, but saw bloodshed, righteousness, but heard a cry.
So in some ways you could say the parable becomes an extended parable because it kind of keeps going, right? The vineyard owner gets wild grapes, so what does he decide to do to the vineyard?
Tear it down.
Tear it down,
Destroy it.
right?
Yeah.
Maybe start over somewhere else because this isn't going to work here. And why is God saying this to Israel? What did we hear at the end of this section?
He was looking for justice, but instead he saw bloodshed and distress.
And what's interesting here is there's some play on some Hebrew words happening here. And the English actually does a pretty good job of doing that, except you don't hear quite the rhyming to it. So expected justice, but saw bloodshed, righteousness, but heard a cry. In Hebrew, it's he expected mishpat, but instead mishpah. So instead of mishpat, justice, there was mishpah, bloodshed. Instead of tzedakah, which is righteousness, he got zekah, an outcry. So there's a play off of words here that hearing that in the original language, you would have been like, ooh, I see what they're doing there. Instead of mishpat, mishpah. Instead of tzedakah, tzedakah. So it's like almost the same, but instead it's two very different things. What else jumps out to you about the parable?
You just hear God's heart so much. What more could I have done?
Right.
What more could I have done? I've invested myself. I've invested resources, everything that you need to be a people of God. And instead I get injustice and unrighteousness and distress and all that stuff. I mean, you just hear God's heart. It almost like it's breaking.
It reminds me of Jesus looking over Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Saying, oh, Jerusalem, how I wanted to care for you, how I wanted to gather you, but you would not have it. And I think any time as a parent, you understand, like when you have good things in store for your child and you've created this great environment and opportunity, but then they go in a different direction.
Yeah.
And it's like, I have to discipline you now in order for me to hold up my end of the bar, or I have to let you walk in your own consequences from your actions. And either way, it's both heartbreaking, but also frustrating, you know, to see that happen. And that's just like, and I'm talking, then when somebody else is involved, you're seeing, so imagine one child doing, like, harming another, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
you know, that was smaller and more vulnerable. And now there's that component that you see here. And God, like, part of, I think, the reason why God hates injustice is because if we're supposed to be made in his image and he's given us authority and rule and influence and power, and we use it for ourselves and not him, it actually undermines the very message that he's trying to convey with us as people in authority and power.
Yeah. Who did God create this people and adopt them to be?
His ambassadors and example.
His ambassadors, his example, his
mhm.
light, his
Yeah.
justice, his righteousness in the world.
Right.
Here, I'm going to give you this gift of the law.
Mhm.
And by living this way, you're going to be this example to the world
Mm.
of what flourishing looks like, what the good
Mhm.
life looks like, what it looks like to walk with God, what it looks like to care for others. I wanted justice for you. I wanted righteousness for you. But instead, I get wild grapes.
Mm.
I get
Mm.
mishpah, bloodshed. I
Mm.
get zeka, outcry. So what a powerful way to illustrate that through a parable. And again, just a nod to Jesus. Did Jesus tell any stories or parables about planting things with different results?
All
Yeah.
the parable of the soils.
Yep, parable of the soils.
The parable of the wheat and the tares, where
Yep.
he has had his workers sow wheat in the field, but then the enemy comes in and sows tares among the wheat, and the workers say, "What do we do with this?" And he said, "Well, just let it grow. We'll separate it when the time comes."
Mhm.
Yeah, that one in particular jumped out to me as I was thinking about this Old Testament parable,
Yeah.
because you have
Mm.
an expected outcome,
Mhm.
but the result is an unexpected outcome.
Yeah, and then I think of the one, was it the fig tree, where it had grown for 3 years, and then the owner was like, tear it down. And then the gardener was like, let's just give it one more year.
And I'll
like,
care for
and I'll
it.
care for it.
Mm.
And so that's a kind of interesting take from this, because it's like still holding out grace and another opportunity, but it also speaks to, it's not even just disappointment and frustration. It's also just a steward of resources.
Mhm.
Like I'm not just going to keep pouring in resources into something that's not going to bear fruit. And so, but the grace is, let's give it another year.
Mm.
Yeah. And that's really where Isaiah ends up by the end,
Mm.
because we have this promised hope,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
So at the beginning, we get this call out, right? I wanted righteousness. I wanted justice. You're giving me bloodshed and causing the poor to cry out to me.
Mm.
I'm going to have to just tear all this down and destroy it and start over. But we have a God who does start over.
Mm.
And the end of Isaiah is the promised hope of the Messiah, who we believe is Jesus,
Mhm.
who then comes and dies,
Mm.
rises again, and then invites us into a new garden in eternity where we get to live with him forever. And so we do have this promised hope, to your point, Rasul. But this parable tells a little bit of a different story right now. And it's the fact that when God wants justice and righteousness, and we live in ways that are self-destructive and harmful to others, God has to do something about that. And he will do something about that, because he does care about what's good, not just for his glory, but also for the good of the world. And this parable does a great job of kind of introducing us to that side of God.
Thought-provoking conversations about some Old Testament parables on this episode of the Discover the Word podcast. Just like Jesus' parables, these parables challenge our thinking about what God is like, and challenge us to become aware of some blind spots in the way we think about and the way we live our lives. Daniel Ryan Day leading Bill Crowder, Vivian Mabuni, and Rasul Berry in the study called Old Testament Parables. Thanks for studying along with us. Hope you found it as profitable as we did. Discover the Word is a small group Bible study from Our Daily Bread Ministries in Grand Rapids, Michigan, in which we invite you to walk with us through topics and passages that inform the way we read the Scriptures, challenge us as we live our lives as followers of Christ, and always point us to discover Jesus in the pages of the Bible. Now, Discover the Word is part of Our Daily Bread Ministries, and our mission is to make the life-changing story and wisdom of the Bible understandable and accessible to people all around the world. You may not know about all of the ways the ministry does that, but in addition to our radio program and podcasts, devotionals and books, we also have unique programs reaching people with specific needs across the globe. One example is teen devotionals that are created by our team in Malaysia, which are helping teens bring their messy situations and emotions to God. You can partner with us by going to discovertheword.org and clicking the Donate button. That's up at the top of the page. Thank you. And thanks for listening. I'm Brian Hettinga. Discover the Word is provided by Our Daily Bread Ministries.